So let me just ask you a simple question about it. Should the United States strengthen or weaken sentences for child pornographers?
Senator, that's not a simple question, and the reason is because what this country does in terms of penalties is in Congress's province. You all decide. You all decide what the penalties are. You decide what the factors are that judges use to sentence. If you determine that any set of penalties is insufficient, then it is in your purview to make that determination. There are many crimes that Congress has determined warrant mandatory minimum penalties, warrant other kinds of penalties, and that is in your purview to determine.
I have to say, Judge, I think whether or not we should strengthen or weaken sentences for child pornographers is a pretty simple question, but I'll move on. I think the difference we've heard today gets to this simple fact that a bunch of elite lawyers, whether they're judges or federal prosecutors or public defenders or law professors, think that sentences for child pornography are too harsh. I don't, and I bet a lot of normal Americans don't either. You have said repeatedly that sentencing is a discretionary act, and I understand that and I agree with it. But you always seem to use your discretion in these child pornography cases to reduce the sentences. I have to say, if I had that discretion, I'd probably throw the book at child pornographers. Maybe that's just me. But let's turn to drug crime. Last year, more than 100,000 Americans died from drug overdose. Drug overdose deaths and gang crime have both skyrocketed in recent years. At the same time that a lot of soft-on-crime laws and lower sentences have been advocated, including, on occasions, Judge, by yourself. In general, do you think the United States should weaken or strengthen sentences for fentanyl traffickers? Traffickers, not users.
Senator, whether or not Congress chooses to strengthen or weaken penalties for any crime is a determination of this body, which is ordinarily made after study and review, determination. That is in the province of Congress.
Well, Judge, you've said before that sentencing is a discretionary act, so that is literally the job of the judge in many of these cases to determine whether to have a shorter or a longer sentence.
Respectfully, Senator, the judge makes that determination not based on one data point in general, which is what you asked me. In general, should we lower or heighten sentences? A judge is making a determination in a particular case, looking at all of the factors. It's discretionary for sure, but we do so within the bounds of a sentencing range that Congress prescribes. And at times in which Congress decides that a penalty needs to be heightened, they impose a mandatory minimum. Then our range is shorter. And when we're looking at the crime, we're not looking as a policy matter across all fentanyl crimes and determining whether the penalty should be increased. As a judge, we are asked in the context of a single prosecution regarding a particular person who has committed a horrible crime, but also, says Congress, is a person who has a life, who has a job, who has all of the other factors that Congress has told judges they have to look at when they decide what penalty to impose in that particular case between the range that Congress sets. So it's not a situation in which I can, in my role as a judge, tell you as a general matter whether penalties should be increased or decreased.
I have to say, I think that not many Americans, especially not the 100,000 Americans who's lost someone to drug overdose, think these are tough questions. But let's move on. Let's talk about retroactivity. When you were on the Sentencing Commission, you repeatedly advocated for retroactively reducing drug trafficking sentences. So this is a case where a drug kingpin who's dealing fentanyl gets sentenced, and then a few years later, he gets lucky. He gets in front of some new judge who's maybe more sympathetic and thinks he got a raw deal, or maybe he just gets in front of the same judge a few years removed from seeing the faces of the victims of his crime. Do you believe that resentencing years after a conviction tends to reduce sentence lengths?
Senator, Respectfully, I just wanted to remark on your previous question and your statement that these are not difficult questions. It's not that they're difficult questions, it's that they're not questions for me. I am not the Congress. I am not making policy around sentencing. My job is to look in a particular case and decide what the penalty should be within the range that Congress prescribes.
I understand. You were making policy, though, at the Sentencing Commission, and you're implementing changes to sentencing guidelines. So my question again is, do you believe that resentencing years after a conviction tends to reduce sentence lengths?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Obviously, if you resentence, you're giving the judge another opportunity to look at the circumstances in light of the changed penalties. Sometimes the judge in that new situation will keep the same penalty. A resentencing is just an opportunity for the judge to reevaluate in light of the changed circumstances.
Okay. Almost without exception, retroactively weakening sentencing laws and guidelines lets harden criminals out early. I always hear the argument, I hear it from some of the senators on this panel, I heard a version of it from you earlier, that each case is going to go before a judge and it won't be an automatic release because each judge is going to assess the facts and hear the arguments. In 2014, you said that judges would not likely reduce the sentences in the vast majority of cases if sentencing guidelines for drug trafficking were reduced. I think you missed that one, Judge. Since 2014, when retroactive reduction took effect, approximately 2/3 of all convicted drug traffickers who asked for early release got it. That's 31,614 hardened drug traffickers back on the streets. More than 7,500 of those hardened drug traffickers use weapons in their crimes. So that means that only 1/3 of these drug traffickers who sought to have retroactive reduction of their sentence were denied. Judges, 1/3, a vast majority.
Senator, it's hard for me to answer questions about these numbers because I'm trying to understand whether this is a retroactive release that was a result of the Sentencing Commission's actions or Congress's. Congress made a decision about retroactive reductions in drug penalties. So I'm just not sure what.
But Judge, in both cases, we always hear the argument, whether it's from members of Congress to include senators on this committee or the Sentencing Commission, that we shouldn't worry, there's going to be individualized case-by-case determination.
And that is my experience. That's when there is a retroactive change. So what happens is that whether it's the guidelines that are changed or the laws that are changed, which happens in Congress, there is a subsequent determination as to whether or not to apply that retroactively, apply that change, so that both the people who get convicted of that penalty moving forward and the people who have already been convicted, both of them get the benefit of the change if the determination is made to make it retroactive. Under that circumstance where you're talking about a penalty change applied to prior people, each one of those prior people goes back before a judge. And a judge, usually the sentencing judge in the first instance, will reevaluate whether or not to, this is generally, there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, the judge will reevaluate whether or not to give that person the benefit of the change. This is an individual assessment. That's what Congress requires in every sentence, and ultimately one that benefits all of us under the law, because judges are being asked to look at these cases and not make just generalized determinations.
So the 2014 comment was specifically about the Sentencing Commission, but generally, whether it's in front of the Commission or the Congress, we always hear this argument that judges are going to make these individualized cases and not that many people will be released. I'll point out that of the 1/3 that were not reduced, the vast majority of those were not eligible. The percentage of cases in which a sentence is not reduced for public safety reasons because someone is viewed as too dangerous to release early is 1%. It's 1%.